Good morning and welcome back to our Matthew Bible study. We've been studying the book of Matthew. We're kind of beginning to wind down. Remember, you can find worksheets at www.oldunioncoc.com. There you can find the rest of the series in case you missed any, if you're just finding it now. I will let you know we are winding down. And here, after today's lesson, is kind of my calendar. We hope to be done with the book of Matthew by July. I'll have a new series starting from the Old Testament as we head into August, and more about that in the next few weeks. But today we're looking at the King's Anointing and Betrayal. We're going to look at the King's Supper. That will be about communion. I think it'll be an informative lesson for many of you as we look at the Passover as it transitions into what we often call the Lord's Supper. The King's Trial and the King's Victory. Remember, we have been looking at Jesus as King, and that is how Matthew portrays him. Remember, many of the parables, the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, I want us to look at Matthew 26. Matthew 26. Will you join me there today? Matthew 26. You can tell we're getting near the end of the book. Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, that he said to his disciples, "You know after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Again, we're going to spend a lot of time on the Passover next week. If you're not familiar with that, I hope that you will tune into that lesson. It'll help you better understand what Jesus was doing and what meal they were observing, and how that Jesus uses that meal to begin to look at the New Testament or the new covenant that God would give. So there are really two things here that I want us to look at today. The first, when Jesus had finished all these sayings. We're going to go back and do a little review, right? What were all the sayings? Maybe you're just tuning in. The second is, the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Now remember, look at the audience here. The audience here are what? The disciples. The disciples. He's not speaking this to everyone. He's speaking this to those who have been following. And remember, those who have been following have often pulled Jesus aside and said privately, "Can you explain that to us? What did you mean by that?" Right? So, all these sayings. Well, what were all these sayings? If you just started reading in Matthew 26, you have missed several stories that we have told. They're available on the website. You can go back for the last probably 3 lessons or so and look at those. So when it says all these sayings, what were they? Well, let's remind ourselves, those who have been a part of the study. Remember Matthew 24? In Matthew 24, for 2 chapters back, he talked about his coming. Remember, he's walking out of the temple and he says there's going to come a time when this temple doesn't exist anymore, and the people can't imagine a time that was true. And so they have lots of questions. As a matter of fact, there are 3 different things they ask, you may remember. And a lot of people remember Matthew 24 as one big long answer to one question: when is he coming? That's not all that they ask in that. And so I'd encourage you to go back and look at that lesson if you have questions about that, because a lot of people are concerned of when Jesus is coming, and I think there's some great clues there. Remember, tell us when these things will be. When will the temple not be here anymore? And what will be the sign of your coming? And the end of the age. 3 things that he talks about there. 3 things that he talks about there. That the temple won't be anymore. That basically Jerusalem will not be the center of worship anymore, that they will be scattered. And then when is Jesus coming back? And so, again, many people read the first part of that chapter and they think that that's about him coming back in the end, his second coming. That's not really what he's talking about there. Go back and look at that passage, if you will. They do say, will there be signs? And he says, yeah, it's going to be a regular day. Remember, we looked at that. It's going to be like in the days of Noah. Remember, Noah was building the ark. He built the ark for 120 years. 120 years. It rained 40 days and 40 nights. They're on the ark for about a year, but he built it for 120 years. And in that building, people probably laughed, they probably wondered, people lived, they died, they went on with their life. And it says, like in the days of Noah, they're going to be eating and drinking, they're going to be going to weddings. I mean, it's going to be a normal day. A lot of people say they know the day that Jesus is coming, right? Or they wish they had a sign. Well, he's telling us, he's just going to come. He's just going to come whenever the Father tells him it's time. You may remember, we looked at that in a parable. We spent a lot of time looking at Jewish weddings. Probably taught you a lot about weddings of the first century that you did not know. Remember, we talked about how a wedding looked like and how the bridegroom came somewhat unexpectedly. He had been preparing for this. They marched around the city, and Jesus tells a story about some ladies who had run out of oil. And we talked about how when we hear the word wedding, we have a picture in our mind of what a wedding looks like. But we had to see what they saw a wedding to look like. What was going on in the story? Why was he late? Why was it 12 o'clock at night? What was going on in that? Well, we covered that, and maybe you'll go back and listen to that. Remember, we were invited to the wedding. I showed you that God has a plan for us to be invited to the wedding, and it's up to us to choose whether we'll be ready when the time comes. And so I would encourage you again to look at these verses and to spend some time with them. We then saw another parable, for the kingdom of heaven is like. Remember, we've looked at lots of those. And the kingdom of heaven is like, in this case, was what? A man going on a journey. And he left goods. He left money for servants to do things with. And then when he comes back, he calls each one in and says, what did you do with what I gave you? And we got all the way down, right, to the guy he gave 1 talent to. And he hid it. He didn't use what God had given. You know, so many times we want more from God. Oh, if God had just given me the opportunity. Sometimes he gives it in the day-to-day small things. And you know, if we can't do the day-to-day things, imagine a 2-year-old who wants to become a track star, but they can't even tie their shoe right now, right? I mean, we have to start with those baby steps. And so maybe God is giving you one thing to do right now so that he can say, well done, good and faithful servant. You want to be the 5-talent guy, right? You want to do all these things. He says, no. Just do this one thing for me right now. Look into that. And then we talked about the parable of the sheep and the goats, right? We looked at how God brings people together and he puts them into categories. And they even asked things like, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you in prison? And basically the answer was what? When you did it to the least of these. When you did it to the least of these. And we even looked at a chart, you may remember, where we looked at the two sides. And we kind of said, what's the difference between these sheep and goats? And really, it was about service to others. It was about service to others. And where did it lead? There was the good and faithful, and there was the wicked. And so I hope maybe in this time that you look to others and think, am I serving others in the name of Jesus? Because when I do, I'm doing it to the least of these. Remember the two answers there. He says, well done, good and faithful servant. Or he says what? You wicked and lazy servant. So, when we look at that text, when he had finished all these things, he's been teaching a lesson. He's been teaching a lesson. And what's the lesson? That Jesus is coming again. So in order for him to come again, something's going to have to happen for him to go away. And so what is it going to be like in the in-between times? Well, it's going to be regular, normal days. It means we're going to be prepared for the bridegroom to come back. It means that we're looking to others and how can we serve them. It's not just becoming a Christian and waiting. It's how do you show your Christianity actively so that Jesus can be seen. Yes, he was going away, but there was something to do in the meantime. And then he says, and he drops kind of a bombshell here. Have you noticed? After all these sayings, he says, the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Now remember, he's called himself the Son of Man several times in this story. And he says the Son of Man will be put to death like a criminal. Now he's saying this to disciples. I think sometimes because we know the next few chapters, we think they know the next few chapters. They don't. When they heard this, this had to be confusing, right? They had to wonder, well, what does that mean? Here's what I find interesting. He doesn't expound. There's no pausing here and explaining what the next few days are going to look like in Jesus' life and in the disciples' life. It just says after these sayings, he kind of said what? And it's not the first time he's hinted that he was going away, right? Remember, some of these guys still think he's putting together what? An earthly kingdom that they're going to get to be a part of. And Jesus is letting them know, no, I'm not going to be around. I'm going away, and you still have responsibilities. Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled. Notice, none of the disciples pull him aside, at least in this text, and say, what do you mean you're going to be crucified? Nobody says, can you expound? There's nobody who's raising their hand and saying, whoa, I got a question. He says that, and then the story moves on. Now remember, we know the story. We kind of know where. That's maybe the first time some of those people heard that. Well, what is the religious community doing at this time? What are they doing? Well, look in verse 3. We're back in Matthew 26. Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. What are the religious leaders doing? They're plotting murder. Imagine you were somewhere with a group of people. Maybe it's a group of ministers or elders or deacons or godly people, and you walk into the meeting and you notice there are charts all over the wall, and you say, hey guys, what are you doing? They say, well, we're plotting a murder. We're going to kill somebody. That's not what you expect. Imagine you went to visit a place to worship on a Sunday morning, and they said today's lesson is how to murder somebody, how to trick somebody, how to get somebody and tell the government that they are a bad person and they need to die. You would say, what is this? Well, that's exactly what's going on here, right? The religious leaders are upset with Jesus. Why? Because he has followers. He's challenging them. Remember, sometimes true Christians challenge those who think they get Christianity. And just because someone is called a Christian, are they Christ-like? Right? Or are they taking care of those hungry and the thirsty and the needy? Or have they just said, oh yeah, I'm a follower, but while the master's away, are you using your talents, right? And so these guys are trying to figure out how they can trick and kill Jesus. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Remember, the Passover's coming. Again, next week, lots on that. They're going to have a feast, and lots of Jews are going to be in town. And they will have heard about it. And remember, Jesus has been healing people. The word Jesus is becoming well known. People are coming out to hear him speak. They're coming to the temple to hear him teach. They've seen him heal. I mean, he's not unknown. So let's not do it when the crowds are here, right? They're going to do this in secrecy. And then Jesus goes to a meal. Now, this is not the meal, the Last Supper that we think of. He's just going to a meal, and he's going in Bethany. We've looked at Bethany before. It's a city outside of Jerusalem, not too far away. It's kind of his place where he goes and relaxes with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, remember. It's his place where he can go and kind of hang out and be himself, right? And so he's at a meal in Bethany. Let's pick the story up there. And when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper. Now that's interesting. Boy, I could talk about leprosy and how Simon would have been treated by society. Again, he would have been an outcast, right? Not a lot of people would have wanted to go to his house because they would have been scared of the skin disease that he had. So he's at Simon the leper's house. I'm sure Simon had invited other people to dinner, and I'm sure they said, ooh, we're not going there. We're not eating with that kind of guy. A woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? So they're having a meal. This woman walks in, pours perfume on Jesus' head. Now that's odd, right? I mean, that doesn't happen at any meal that I've been to. If that happened where you were having a meal, that might get your attention. The smell alone might even be overpowering, right? Notice the disciples' reaction. Not, what is that beautiful smell? Oh, wow. Look, that woman has come to honor Jesus. What a waste. What a waste pouring that on Jesus. Now look at their response. Why this waste? For this fragrant oil might have been sold for much and given to the poor. Now, maybe they still have those sayings in mind, right? Remember, he had just given that whole lesson thing about, if you see people hungry and naked and in prison, you're supposed to do something for them. Maybe they're thinking, oh, maybe that oil could have been sold and we could have done some of those things that... I want you to look at Jesus' reaction here. Jesus doesn't feel this as a waste. Now here's what this lady knows that the others have not. Remember what Jesus said, I'm going up to be crucified. What is she doing with this oil? She's preparing a body for burial. In those days, when a body was going to be buried, it would often be washed and covered in oil. Remember, they don't have the same preservation techniques that we have today. They don't do some of the things to the body that we do today. And so the body, to make it smell good, would be rubbed down with oils and perfumes. She's anointing a body at a feast. Now, that again is a little odd. Let me show you how odd that might be. Imagine you invited me over to your house today, and I'm having dinner with you, and we're eating, and a man walks in and starts taking my measurements. He says, "Do you mind standing up?" And I stand up. He says, "Oh, okay, he's about that tall." Takes my width. And he says, "Okay, he's about how much do you weigh, right?" And you say, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "Oh, I'm just measuring him for a casket." Now, would that be odd? Would that be kind of strange? You say, yeah, that'd be odd. I mean, I wouldn't feel like a very good host, right? Well, now remember, the disciples don't understand everything that's happening here. The disciples are not seeing what's going on with this woman. What are they seeing? They're seeing that this woman has walked in and poured perfume on him. So what's that about? Well, she's preparing a body. But when Jesus was aware of it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always." You want to help poor people? They're here all the time. Don't complain about this woman. Look at the good she's done. "For you have the poor with you always, but me you do not have always. For in pouring this fragrant oil on my body, she did it for" what? "My burial." Do you get it? What a weird thing to say, right? She's pouring this oil on me. Why did I give that guy back? Because I need a casket. "Assuredly, I say to you, whether this gospel is preached, this good news, is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her." Guys, we are in the 21st century. We have technology. And we're still talking about this woman. This woman who came at the proper time with what she had to prepare Jesus for what he was about to go through. Now, that's not what the other disciples are interested in, right? Maybe they said that again because they wanted to get in his good graces. But maybe there's something else going on here. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" Wow. One of the inner circle goes to that group that's plotting murder and says, "What's it worth to you? What's it worth to you that I can get Jesus in a place where it'd be easy for you to pick him up, away from the crowds? What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. You know, they didn't have to worry about finding Jesus. They now had an inside guy. You know, Judas gets a hard rap in the Bible. I'll be honest. He makes some really poor decisions. I think this tells a little bit about Judas's personality here. I want to go to another verse for just a moment. I know we're in Matthew chapter 26. I want to go to John 12 for just a moment. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, if you're new to Bible study. The first 4 books of the New Testament are the life of Christ. And some of the stories repeat, and some of them are new in the different books. But John 12 tells us a little bit about Judas that probably makes us understand something here. Can we read together with this? John 12, verses 4 through 6. "But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, 'Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and give to the poor?'" Here's the situation, again, about perfume. Simon's son, Judas Iscariot, is the one who says, "Why didn't we sell this to the poor?" Look at verse 6. "This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it." Do you know why Judas wanted the perfume sold for money? Because he could skim some of the proceeds off the top. You know, I think sometimes we think Judas just woke up one morning and said, you know what? I think I'm going to turn Jesus in. Remember, people followed Jesus for all kinds of reasons. They thought he was going to be what? An earthly king. There would be people who would say, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Judas had been following and had realized how easy it was to collect money in the name of Jesus and take some of it. Judas already had betrayal in his heart before he ever is going to have it in a kiss. And we'll look at that in a few lessons, right? Judas is, and you say, well, why would he do that? Why would he? Because he began to realize, I think, that Jesus' kingdom was not going to be an earthly. He was not going to be the treasurer and able to rule the money like he wanted. And so what can I get for this now? 30 pieces of silver? Bam, that's what I want. And so we find that Judas had some issues, and his is probably greed. His is probably too much tied to the earth. You know, I found several things about Judas that I want us to close with. This one says, Judas chose to follow Jesus. He made his own decision to enter the school of Jesus. And he stayed with our Lord during his earthly ministry for 3 years. Yet we're told that he was a devil. Look at John 6, verse 70 sometime. Look at what it says also about Judas there. It wasn't that Judas was genuinely converted and then fell out of grace and was lost. Rather, although he was close to Jesus, he was never a converted man. I want you to look at that. He knew Jesus. He had seen Jesus. He knew what Jesus, but he was never converted. You know, a lot of you know Jesus. You know stories about Jesus. Maybe through this study, you've learned some things you didn't know. But are you converted? Will he really help you? I mean, are you really letting him do things in your life? That ought to give us pause as we consider the state of our own souls. You know how you can be near something but not let it affect you? You ever been there? You ever been near something? You know, I think about people who talk a good game, but then they don't do anything, right? They can figure, they've got all the problems of the world solved, but they won't make a step to get any of them started. I have students all the time. I'm a teacher. I have students all the time who are going to be better next semester, or man, they're going to leave middle school, and when they go to high school, they're going to really turn it on. The problem is those are little steps and skills you learn along the way, right? And Judas had a chance for 3 years to be next to Jesus, but he was never converted to Jesus. That's why I think some of you probably struggled in the time we're in now. You were converted to a format of Jesus, and that format was maybe showing up on a Sunday and maybe singing a few songs and shaking a few hands and discussing how the game was going to turn out afterwards or on Monday night. Maybe it was a group who was very social, but maybe not very service-oriented. And so maybe you've struggled in this time because while you knew Jesus and you were near Jesus, you were never converted to Jesus. You know, I can drive by a gym every day. That's not going to help me. Maybe if I walked by it, right? But unless I go into that gym and commit myself to some kind of regiment, that's when things are going to change. You see, some of you have been just parking yourself in church, but not participating to be the church. Church is a geographical location for you, not a change on the inside. And so Judas, and I think we need to think about that. You know, we often talk about Peter's betrayal. Peter also was with Jesus, and later we're going to find a betrayal there. Do we ever betray Jesus? Do we ever go on a Sunday and we say things like we love our neighbor and we amen a sermon about things that need to change, and then we walk out of the building and not a single thing has changed? We don't think any differently about our neighbor, and we don't go share the gospel. I also found this about Judas. That was by R.C. Sproul, by the way. I also found this one. It said Judas had the best pastor, the best leader, the best advisor, the best counselor. Yet he failed. You ever thought about Judas was getting the same lessons everybody else got? The problem is not the leadership or the church you go to. And I think some of you in this time, maybe you've questioned your leadership, how they've decided to meet or not meet, or what helps they've given you. Or maybe they've told you that you've got to study on your own for the first time ever. For the first time ever, you've had to lead worship in your house, right? If your attitude or character doesn't change, or your heart doesn't transform, you'll always be the same. You know those students who used to leave me in middle school in 8th grade, and they were going to go to 9th grade, and they were going to turn it on when they were going to start taking notes, and they were going to read middle school was just, a stopping place till they really got to high school. Well, I would have some of them begin as juniors at the school that I taught at. And you know what? They were really going to turn it on once they got to college. Unless something changes about our character and our actions, things don't change. It's a lip service, right? And some of us go to church some Sundays and we think, I'm going to change. But maybe we haven't made a step in the right direction to do that. Judas is one that's right in the center. Right in the center. But what's he concerned about? For him, it's money. For him, it's money. For some of us, it's something different, right? The devil knows each of us in our own temptations. So, I think about that. How do I treat those that are less than or the least of these? Well, I think it goes back to what? All these things, right? How did Judas see some of these people? He obviously didn't, he said, but we could have sold that for the poor. But what's he really saying? But I could skim some of that money off the top for me. Do you ever do service so you can tell other people about it? Or do you ever do it just to do it because it's the right thing to do? Do you ever say, well, I'm going to go pack some food. We helped the homeless this weekend. I know there's a way you need to let people know what your church is doing to help other people, what they do outside the walls, right? But do you ever do it just to go take a selfie and to say, look at what I did? Or do you ever do things in secret sometime for the least of these that no one will ever know except God the Father and the Son and the Spirit? You see, Judas was caught up in this world. And if Jesus wasn't going to be a part of this world, I'm not sure he wanted anything to do with it. And so he wanted to cash out. And you know what? Some of us have to realize that we're going to hear these words. The opportunities that we have. And while we don't have the opportunity to literally be with Jesus, we have the opportunity to be Jesus to a lost and dying world. So look at those last words again. Well done, good and faithful servant. Or you wicked and lazy servant. Jesus is on a journey. He knows what the end looks like. There's still those on that journey who aren't quite sure. There's a group plotting against him. There's someone close selling him out. And next week, he's going to sit down and have dinner with those that he's closest to. And he's going to drop another bombshell. I hope you'll be with us. What have we said the last few weeks? And boy, is it continuing to be good news from the things that we're seeing in the news, right? What? Wash those hands. Maybe I should even say, wear that mask. Clean that heart. But most of all, have a blessed day.